Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we find out if all of this was supposed to happen. Let's get started. For many of my listeners, especially the new ones that haven't listened to many of our podcast episodes before, a lot of the things that are going on in the world right now are incredibly confusing. Things are happening and changing constantly, and it does kind of look pretty bad for Israel. And if you're listening to this podcast, chances are you support Israel, or at least consider it. So seeing all of this negative press, all the negative headlines, everybody seemingly turning against Israel, it can get incredibly confusing. It can make you question, am I on the wrong side of this? And honestly, even for someone like myself, who obviously has many years of training and knowledge in this field, has seen this before, it still can get a little bit scary at times because we are in pretty much uncharted waters at this point. I'm hoping on this podcast episode to talk a little bit about how we might be missing some very important things that are happening, even right in front of our face. A lot of the things that are happening currently that may seem negative could actually be signs of positivity, signs of winning, and we might have missed it. Maybe all of this stuff was actually supposed to happen exactly how it's happening, even if we don't understand it. For any of my longtime listeners, you might remember from Season 3, Episode 124, we did an episode called Why Have Things Become So Bad? If you haven't heard that one, you might want to go listen to that one afterwards. You don't need to listen to it first, but it's pretty interesting. In this episode, we spoke a little bit about a rabbi who claims that all of the things that we are seeing currently are actually part of a larger plan. If you look at certain sources he uses, it suggests that this is how it's supposed to play out. As a small example, I won't go into it all in this episode because you can go back and listen to the other one. One of the two examples that I'll give you from that podcast episode is when this rabbi makes the claim that in the Torah, or the Old Testament for Christian followers, it specifically says that the world will either love or hate the Jews. There isn't going to be a middle ground of people with no opinion. And we're seeing, in real time, there aren't a lot of people out there today that say they don't really have an opinion on Israel and on the Jews. You either love us or you hate us. He, ironically enough, points out the fact that if you walk around most cities in the West and ask someone, how do you feel about Israel? Not a lot of people will say, I don't know. Everybody knows and everybody has an opinion. Meanwhile, you ask them about China and Taiwan and they couldn't care less and couldn't find it on a map. Why is it that people love or hate Israel specifically? And he says you can see it in the prophetic books, that this is supposed to happen. Another point that he makes is that the Jewish people will return home to Israel. That is a very huge factor in the Jewish religion. It's also why evangelical Christians love supporting Israel and the Jews, because to them, it is also very important for Jews to return home. And we have seen, post-October 7th, massive amounts of Jewish people going home, mostly because the diaspora has become incredibly dangerous for them, ignoring hate crimes, for example, and they want nothing to do with it. So this tiny piece from that last episode, which by the way was from 2024, which in a year seems to only be more true, it proves that maybe some of these things that we're experiencing, the hostility to Jews around the world, the way the government is treating the Jewish people, and even seeing the world turn against the Jewish people, some of them at least, is all supposed to happen. It's already written. It was written thousands of years ago that this would happen. But what I find is much more interesting in 2025 over 2024 when I did that first episode is that things have been ratcheted up even more. But things are changing possibly for the better. The worse things get in the West, the more we're following prophecy in Israel. Let me explain. So the idea behind this recognition of Palestine coming up in September, supposedly Canada, Australia, France, and England are going to recognize a Palestinian state, although this is merely symbolic. You can listen to our last episodes about that. But the fact that they're doing it has created waves around the world. And the biggest wave that's happened is we've actually seen for the first time ever Israel expressing the interest in annexing officially Area C of the West Bank and talking about taking sovereignty over the area of the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. For many listeners, you might not understand how important this is or how big this is. But since obtaining the West Bank or Judea and Samaria after 1967, Israel tried to return that land to Jordan, who refused, who also didn't give up the claim until the 1980s. But since giving up the claim, technically speaking, the Israelis own that land. However, Israel has never officially annexed the land or expressed its sovereignty over the land. It's kind of been a no man's land because they were trying to be nice and maybe have a two-state solution. They left Judea and Samaria with a big question mark. We believe it's ours because of historical records, because of the fact that we won it in a defensive war, because of the fact that it was supposed to be ours under the League of Nations, all of these valid reasons, but we never officially annexed it. Now, post the recognition of Palestine BS you hear from the West, Israel's actually considering, and possibly going to do, a full annexation or expressing its sovereignty over this land. And it's incredibly interesting because I would suggest, and I think many would agree with me, that had it not been for this claim of recognition of the Palestinian state in that land, Israel probably would have continued years of not annexing the land and playing this two-state solution game. So the fact that this pressure campaign started, to us, may seem like a really bad thing. Look at all these countries turning against Israel. But what we're missing is the fact that this pressure might actually cause Israel to give up on this silly mistake of not officially taking ownership over the land that it probably should have taken long ago. For any of our listeners who want to go back and listen to things about the two-state solution and options there, you can listen to some of our old podcasts. But the idea being that Israel is going to counter this BS from the Western world by doing what it probably should have done many, many years ago. Maybe there's something bigger going on here where the world is actually forcing Israel to do the right thing, finally. Let me just first state that I'm not a rabbi. I have no formal training in any of this, but an interesting video popped up for me recently on social media that I thought, either coincidentally or amazingly, spoke to exactly what the topic of this week's podcast was. In a video posted of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, a very important rabbi in New York, he was asked, probably around the time of the Camp David Accords or maybe even Oslo, what he thinks about giving up land for peace. And he had a very interesting response. His response essentially was, from a religious point of view, the land of Israel was given to the Jewish people. It is not for the Israeli government, or frankly for the world, to give up land to other people. And that he suggested that handing over land through peace probably will end up in more punishment to the Jewish people than actual peace. And he wasn't wrong. It made me think he was very much correct. If you look at the peace deals that were made between the Palestinian Arabs and Israel over land in Judea and Samaria for Oslo, pretty much every time that Israel has attempted to make peace with these people, it has essentially ended in Jewish bloodshed. If you look at the Oslo agreements that gave up chunks of Judea and Samaria, what was followed? The Intifada, where thousands of Jewish people were killed by the people that you just gave land to. Giving up land equaled death of Jews. If we look at Gaza, when the Israelis pulled out of Gaza, what followed? Rocket after rocket after rocket, eventually October 7th. And what's kind of interesting about this prophecy is the fact that when we don't really give up land, per se, there isn't violence. Yes, technically when we made peace with Egypt, we gave them the Sinai, although to be fair, the Sinai really isn't Israeli territory, unlike Judea and Samaria. And when we made peace with Jordan, we actually did not hand over all of the area they once controlled. We made peace with them without giving over Judea and Samaria, and without giving over the half of Jerusalem that they controlled. So when no land was involved, peace was held. Whereas on the other hand, you have the Palestinian Arabs who have taken the land and yet turned it into a terror base. So maybe the Rebbe was onto something, that making peace for land will not work. Making peace definitely seems to work. And just like how the world has really stupidly tried to threaten a Palestinian state, has forced Israel to actually do what they should have done a long time ago, which was annex the land officially. And maybe this was all part of the big plan. Talk about a plan that God had to force Israel to do what they were supposed to do, which is take back their land, as opposed to waiting for this sometime in the future when maybe there'll be two states where they again give over land and it ends up probably the way it ended up the last times. So maybe this random feeling that these world powers are turning against Israel might actually be doing Israel a favor, making Israel do what they should have done, and they haven't been willing to do, for the sake of world opinion and to be politically correct. And this may not only extend to the Jewish people and the Israeli government, but also the world as a whole. We recently heard the news that Argentinian President Javier Milei is planning on moving their embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. In addition, Serbia has also said they will move their embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. This may seem like a relatively minor action, but it might be bigger than you think. For any of my listeners who aren't aware of this controversy over where the embassy is, most embassies were in Tel Aviv because many countries wanted to keep it out of Jerusalem because originally Jerusalem was a divided city, plus there's the controversy over which side of Jerusalem belongs to who. So many countries avoided it, just left their embassies in Tel Aviv and don't move them. Many years ago, the United States decided to move their embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. However, many presidents had a waiver signed to delay that physical move. That was until the first Trump administration, who didn't sign the waiver to postpone and actually moved it to Jerusalem. This was seen as a massive action of recognizing that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. What is really interesting about this is something I read in the book of the former U.S. ambassador to Israel under the Trump administration who facilitated that move. He points out something very incredible from the prophetic books that shows this is how this is supposed to happen. Former U.S. ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, points out in his most recent book, One Jewish State, that in the book of Isaiah, written about 2,700 years ago, the prophet said specifically that all nations will come to Jerusalem. Now he asks in his book, what exactly does that mean? How do all nations come to Jerusalem? And in his view, in his book, he suggests it's the opening of embassies, moving them to Jerusalem, that is fulfilling that prophecy. The nations are now coming to Jerusalem. By the way, this claim from Isaiah comes literally right before the Isaiah quote that's on the wall at the UN, that all nations will turn their weapons into plowshares, there will be no more war. And right before that, it says that all wars are going to end when all nations come to Jerusalem. So maybe, despite all of the war and the terrible things we're seeing, this might be the way it's supposed to be happening. We are seeing embassies being moved to Jerusalem as they should, recognizing the capital of the Jewish state. So much like the prophecy once said, on the one hand, you have people who hate the Jews, who are trying to stab them in the back with a fake Palestinian state. And that same fervor could be used by other people to move their embassies to Jerusalem in order to recognize the official capital of the Jewish state. No doubt there are still many countries who are refusing to do that, not recognizing Israel's sovereignty over Jerusalem. But nonetheless, it is happening. So even though things do look pretty bleak, things could even look terrible at times, you have to realize that there might be a bigger picture here, that some of these bad things might lead to what's supposed to happen, and good things. For example, unfortunately everybody is very upset that there's no ceasefire in Gaza, but meanwhile, because there's no ceasefire, because Israel has begun moving into Gaza City, we have released this past week 3 dead bodies that were of hostages that were being held and could have still been in Gaza for months as we played back and forth for a ceasefire. Israel got those bodies back because they didn't try and make a peace deal. Of course, we want everybody back as quickly as possible, but the point being, making a bad deal just for peace or just for a ceasefire might end up doing more harm and more punishment to the Jewish people. Meanwhile, we've gotten a few people back and taken out some pretty big names because there wasn't a deal made. We also heard this week some pretty major news, which is that the United Nations has officially ended the mandate of UNIFIL. UNIFIL started its mandate in the 1970s to provide a buffer zone between southern Lebanon and northern Israel, being that there was a war between the PLO in southern Lebanon and Israel. Unfortunately, UNIFIL was pretty much useless as they allowed Hezbollah to get into the region and become the second most powerful terrorist group in the entire world. So they were pretty much useless, as we found out during our recent conflict. However, as we all got the terrible news about the bombings in the north, Israel destroyed Hezbollah to the point where Lebanon has officially taken back control of their country. Their new president has put a ton of effort into removing Hezbollah from his country, as Lebanon was supposed to be doing over the last number of years. Thanks to the work of the IDF during the conflict with Hezbollah, Hezbollah has been weakened so much that the Lebanese can actually have a chance to get rid of them, which would be game-changing. And not only that, recently the talks are that Lebanon is going to join the Abraham Accords and have official peace with Jerusalem. This is something we would have never imagined 5 years ago. And in another bombshell we heard in the news, Iran, supposedly, is in full collapse. They have very huge issues with water right now. They can't feed their own people. Meanwhile, they're sending rockets to the Houthis, which surely pisses off their people. There is talk of possible civil war, people trying to out the IRGC, get rid of their terrorist leadership. The Ayatollah himself is currently dying, apparently. No one really knows what the future has in store for Iran, if it will even survive the next decade. And if it doesn't, that's huge. All of their proxies are essentially gone at this point. They've got nobody left. And they're soon going to lose control of their own people. It's hard to look at all of the things that are happening currently and not think that there's something good happening here. Despite all of the bad news, all of the terrible headlines, the feeling that you're being abandoned by the world and your neighbors and your friends, it seems like real things are happening. Things that we never imagined would have happened in the past. In the end, I know that sometimes the news can be pretty bleak, especially if you have friends and family members who you disagree with about Israel or about this current situation. Lord knows if you have 2 Jewish people in a room, you're probably going to have 3 opinions. People are having a lot of trouble with what's going on. It seems like everything is backfiring. Things are going badly. The world is hating Israel. We're losing all of our allies. But the reality is, despite the fact that it looks that way at times, things are happening in a huge way. Israel is finally doing what it needs to do to protect itself, and seemingly no longer bowing to the world pressure and this idea for peace at the expense of Jewish lives. Israel is finally putting its foot down and saying no more. And it's possible that this is the way it was always supposed to be. Unfortunately, it took us a little time to learn it, and we had to be pushed by the international world and by all the people who hate Israel to do what we probably should have done a very long time ago, which was not care about world opinion and do what's best for Israel and the Jewish people. Because maybe when we make the mistake of going against our own interests and trying to appease a world who may or may not hate us, it doesn't end up working out in our favor. But in the end, we get pushed into the right direction and be put on the path to the way things were supposed to be and what we should have done. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.